Hello again, everyone. I am excited to continue this discussion from the previous video that I just did. And the last one I talked about historical perspectives of the concepts of LGBTQIA individuals in the past. And I want to kind of carry that forward into a little bit more of now, our perspective in doing now. So my name is Dr. Christine Coons. I'm an internal medicine physician. And when I first started really reviewing the medical literature and science behind all this, it took me a couple years to piece together all the information and perspectives that I needed to glean so I can make a cohesive set of slides and perspectives that would make sense to most people. We have so many different perspectives that are being thrown at us left and right that it's hard to sift through all the information. And as a consequence of that, we tend to anchor on one of those perspectives. And you'll see that in this next set of slides. And so I'm going to shift over to the slides and show you what it's all about. So first up, of course, we're going to talk about sex, and no, we're not talking about that type of sex. The current people's terminology is saying is biological sex, but I think once you see where this is going, you'll find that the concept of sex is way more broad than we think it is. So I wanted to start with a strong foundation, kind of like a soup stock. If you have a strong foundation, then everything tastes good. You can blend things together and make it more palatable. So we need to start with a strong foundation of why sex does not have a universal definition. We often find this global pattern of description of male and female, and we have all these statistics, and people will point to that and go back to the Punnett square and say, well, based off of the Punnett square and chromosomes and things like that, we are going to base our definition off of that perspective. From a medical perspective, from a scientific literature's perspective, that's a very narrow scope of what sex is all about. During arguments online, you will find that people come along and say, well, it's your sex assigned at birth. Great, you just referenced anatomic sex. You have looked down at the child during a brief physical exam and you said you either have a penis or a vagina, and you go from there. Now, from a medical perspective, we run into trouble when we say, well, they have quote unquote ambiguous genitalia. Well, then we have to go further into this, or along those same lines, when people come along and say, well, what about intersex? Well, then the next argument will be something along the lines of, well, it's based off their chromosomes, either they are XX or XY. And we haven't delved into the variations that exist, even with chromosomal perspective. So we've talked briefly about Klinefelters, somebody who is XXY, and somebody will come along and say, well, they have a Y chromosome, therefore they must be male. Well, that doesn't actually take into account all the perspectives and phenotypes that are available for somebody with Klinefelters. There's a good percentage of people who have a Klinefelter's karyotype that are assigned female at birth. So it's not always male assigned at birth for those who are Klinefelters. And then we can look at gonadal sex. Well, they have a testes or an ovary. Well, that becomes even more difficult to work with as well, because we can have neither. You can have what's called streak gonads. You can have an ovary on one side. You can have a testes on the other. You can have a mixture of both of them together, where it's called an ovotestes. So when on the surface, you can analyze this and say, well, yes, there's male and female, but once you dive any deeper into it, you run into problems. Not necessarily problems, but a variability and diversity that exists within each one of these perspectives. During the last video, I talked about a dictionary definition of sex. This is one perspective that we've used in our culture and society to define male and female. Well, there's other issues with this as well. You can look at hormones, their ability to reproduce or not reproduce, and how that changes over time. You can look at somebody who is born and say, well, they're not able to be, capable of reproduction. So how do we define sex based off of their ability to reproduce when they're not capable of reproducing until they are well into puberty? And we run into issues with the definitions of legal, We're running into problems with what is really defined as biological sex. Then we can look at the perspectives of society's perspectives on sex, theological perspectives on sex. How does the brain develop in the midst of all this? Our terms and language that we use to describe sex. I actually had a funny moment with my wife a couple weeks ago as I was creating this slide. She's like, how many times can you put the word sex on one slide? And we got a good laugh out of that. But when you compile all these things together, compare it and contrast it with things like gender identity and gender expression, we have to piece all this together into one cohesive whole to come up with a complete perspective of sex. This is why there is no universal definition of sex. When you look at things like the executive order in the United States, they are falling on this perspective and definition that they're using biological sex, which is usually based off of the dictionary definition of sex, and they're forcing people to define themselves along these patterns and lines. The challenge is when you take the whole entire picture together, it becomes much more muddy, it becomes much more gray area. The last point on this slide is perceived sex. This is how other people view other people. So if I'm walking down the street and I'm looking at a person, I am pulling in information about that person based off of their height, their weight, their clothes that they're wearing, their hairstyle that they have, the sound of their voice. I'm looking at the way they walk. I can look at, breast development. I can look at their fat distribution of the body. I can look at facial hair development, the brow ridge. I can pull all this stuff together and make an assumption of a person's sex based off of their appearance. We have in our minds this perspective of what an ideal person of representation of what male and female is. We all do this, and partly because we also have this innate sense of sexual attraction. It's all part of our anatomy and our physiology. That's part of who we are. And so as an ideal, we create in our minds this perspective. And so on the next slide, I talk about that a little bit. I can get to the next slide. So we rapidly pull in this information and we use our prior experience, knowledge, and expectations to make that decision in our brains about who another person is. That's challenging because it's not taking into account what is actually happening internally with that person. When we run into people who we perceive as one sex and we find out that they're different, we run into trouble. We actually have this discordance in our brain about how that works and why that works. And for some of us, we get very angry at that realization because we feel like we're being tricked. We have this ideal in our brain and we have been tricked into thinking otherwise. And maybe that's part of the reason why we have such a backlash against LGBTQIA individuals, especially transgender individuals and even intersex individuals. So the last point I want to make with this, unless we have an intimate knowledge of the person's genetics, anatomy, and development, we can only make inferences on flawed or biased information regarding a person's sex. A few years ago, I created this next slide. And all I've done really is I took the primary sex characteristics and added these two extra components of genetics and development. So in terms of a person being developed or developing, we start with this foundation of genetics, and people will say, well, that starts with conception. Well, people will say this is based off of chromosomes. There's actually a reason why I didn't say chromosomes on this, and because it's so much more than chromosomes. If you remember in a previous video, I talked about chromosomes being just these USB drives. All they're doing is just carrying information. They're really not doing anything of themselves. They're just carrying this data from one cell to another. And in the process of development, they're activated and processed. Well, what are they processing? What are they doing? Well, in terms of the sex characteristics, the primary sex characteristics, there's a whole bunch of things that have to work together to make a person who they are. And there's an immense amount of variability in this. So when we talk about ambiguous genitalia at birth, we're talking about external anatomy. How does it look How do they look at birth? What that is representing is an internal process that is variable, and this may actually alter how the gonads look, how the gametes are produced, how the hormones are functioning inside the body, how the brain develops, how the pituitary gland functions in the midst of all of this, how their internal anatomy has developed in the midst of all this. And really, actually, in the midst of all this, we tend to forget that there's the adrenal gland that is functioning in this as well. So it's not just one thing that we have to look at, it's all the things together and all the variabilities that exist. Again, there is no universal definition of sex. The perception that sex is determined at conception is just overly simplistic. The foundational biologic machinery that leads to sex development is the exact same between males and females, especially early on in development. There is no differentiation in the process of sexual development until about 6 to 8 weeks of gestation. And I call this period of time the common development pathway. And what we have found is of the 21,000 genes, protein encoding genes, there are well over 200 genes that contribute to sex development. It's not just one of these genes. It's not just the S or Y. It's not just SOX9. We have to account for the whole entire picture. So about a month or so ago, I created this slide. And this is very much different than common perceptions based off of this, the biology book that I presented with the zebra on the front that is taught commonly in high school. We have this notion in society that on one side you have male development, on one side you have the female development, and never shall they cross their paths. And that's part of the reason why we go back to sex determination at conception. This is where that notion comes from. Is that you have one, you have the other. There is no intermixing in between the midst of all this. There is no separation, or there's complete separation. They never cross. That's not how this works. So during gestation, during conception, the first thing that an embryo is interested in is not reproduction. It's not interested in what sex you're going to be in the future. Actually, the thing that's most interested in is getting to implantation, getting to the uterus, creating a placenta, and starting the process of developing a human being. The next thing that it's interested in is, again, not reproduction. The next thing it's interested in is actually directions. It's more interested in front, back, up, down, left, and right, so that when we develop as a human, we have front, back, left, right, up, and down. From there, it starts creating this foundation of the GI tract. It's interested in creating a nutritional pathway. So the GI tract starts developing gastralization. And after that, then becomes the brain, the heart, the lungs, the internal anatomy. And then we run into these two structures, mesonephros and paramesonephros. Every embryo starts with these two structures. The mesonephros traditionally goes down the male pathway. The paramesonephros goes down the traditional female pathway. They are both present. They are both there. So in essence, an embryo during these first 8 weeks is undifferentiated. A decision has not been made as whether they're going down the male pathway or a female pathway. That doesn't happen until everything, that foundation, is set and ready to go. At that point, there's this differentiation that takes place. And it's all mostly hinged on this gene that's called SOX9. SOX9 is a gene that's found on chromosome 17, and under normal circumstances, it's under lock and key. It is suppressed because it's both found on male and female chromosomes. Because it is on chromosome 17, it needs to be suppressed. So the way that it's unlocked is by the presence of the Y chromosome, and more specifically, the SRY gene on the Y chromosome. The SRY gene comes along and activates the SOX9 gene, or unlocks it from that restriction. And then you have this pathway that moves forward into the male pathway. There's a significant amount of variability that exists between this. Once this process starts and the male pathway starts developing, it has to suppress the female pathway, and vice versa. If the female pathway is continuing, then the male pathway has to be suppressed. That mesonephros has to be disappeared. It is not always successful in doing that. There is an immense amount of variability that exists in all of this. And you'll see that in one of my future presentations where we talk about the variability that exists between among intersex individuals. We don't always see externally what's going on internally with individuals. And this includes brain development. So I'm going to stop right there, let people kind of absorb all of this stuff. I'm going to come back to this slide and talk about it even more as we talk about going forward with intersex and gender identity. This is going to be a very important slide to remember. So thanks for your time.